Welcome, Dr. Shah. We are so happy to have you here. This is our second conversation. The first one was we just felt almost like kindred spirits a little bit, just saying, here's a doctor who thinks like us and is bringing something new to this world that is desperately needed. And so we're really excited about sharing your story and sharing a product that you're in development with our audience that we think can be a true game changer for our health. So welcome, Dr. Jay Shah.
Thank you so much, Wendy and Debbie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And welcome to Nourish Noshes.
Welcome to Nourish Noshes. And the first thing I think we wanted to do is kick off and just toss this ball to you and ask you what your story is, because it's really quite fascinating to
Sure.
us.
Yeah.
And by the way, I love the name of the show. That's a great creative name. So I love it.
Great.
So yeah, I guess my journey in medicine started like a lot of others probably who have gone into medicine as a child, thinking about wanting to be a doctor. My dad was a doctor. And so, and we're an immigrant family. And so I'm first generation American, and like many immigrants, and many non-immigrants, but, looking at being a physician is maybe sort of one of the highest levels of sort of career aspirations. And so it was always looked at with, high favor. And so I always thought about it, and I really did enjoy science and biology and those kind of things. And so that's why one thing led to another, and I decided to try it. And I ended up going to a medical school in Kansas City, University of Missouri in Kansas City, which is a city general hospital. And if you're not familiar with Kansas City, which maybe most people on your show may not be aware of, but think South Chicago, Southside Chicago, Compton, this kind of environment. We had a prison wing, we had a full inpatient psychiatric hospital. It was a very a lot of sort of drugs and inner city sort of typical kind of issues. But it was actually a really great place to be a medical student because of their relative lack of resources and staffing. Medical students were asked to do many, many more things than oftentimes in larger, very well-resourced institutions. So routinely, you were the first assistant in surgical procedures. Routinely, you were the only person who had medical knowledge in a situation or a room. And it was just a very colorful place to be a medical student. And so there are many things I really enjoyed about it, despite its sort of unfortunate lack of resources in some of the scenarios that. So that was my medical school. And one thing, by luck or chance or combination thereof, I ended up at Massachusetts General Hospital for my internal medicine training. And the best part about that, other than meeting these phenomenal sort of world leaders, who were my cohorts in residency, was that I met my partner and wife there. So that was the best part about going to Mass General. But other than that, the people I was training with, on my left hand would be a guy who had invented 3 molecules and, flew to Boston on a private jet from the government of Singapore. And on my right hand would be a lady who started an NGO and ran it for the WHO for the last 5 years. Wow. And all of these future leaders in medicine, you could tell that the sort of the level of caliber of those sort of, of my sort of peers was just in a different stratosphere. And so
what a direct contrast to your medical school. It couldn't have been more, right?
Such a direct contrast, but having both experiences juxtaposed one after the other was really amazing. Wow. And so I really enjoyed my time there. I did my cardiology training back in the Midwest at Washington University, and then I did something very different from coming from 1,000-bed academic medical training institutions. I went to Portland, Oregon, and started my own practice from scratch. Wow. So it was, a medical assistant and 2 EKG machines. and me, and that was it. And so
that's
it was
brave.
just,
That's very brave.
Very brave.
It was such a different mentality. In fact, many of my sort of professors and academic mentors kind of looked at me like, what are you doing? When I told them that this was my plan, or lack of a plan, just sort of like, this is what I think I want to do. But it was a great learning environment for me. Those first few years of practice are honestly where you learn the most as a physician. I mean, because you're on your own, and I was building a business, building a practice, building a referral base, building credibility, building a patient base, and in the end, there's no big institution behind you. There's no layers of other trainees, and the buck stops with you and only you. And so it was very much a different sort of journey. And I did that for 7 years, and I really enjoyed it. That was, one of the best places in my experience to practice. And then for the last 3 years, I've practiced at the Mayo Clinic. I had this opportunity to come down to the Mayo Clinic with my wife, and I've served as the medical director of thoracic aortic aneurysm diseases. And so that was, again, a very different but very instructive time, and I really enjoyed that as well. So that was been my sort of medical career. And then the last year and a half, I have kind of taken a 90-degree turn, and I've joined a Swiss startup called Aktiia, which is working on a wearable continuous blood pressure monitor. And so that's really what we've been working on. And we're very excited. We have a significant traction. We can talk all about it. But that's been really an education in and of itself, and a marked departure from my 10 plus years now in practice. So that's my story.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, and that story, I think, is, leaving and moving into this new space, that shift is what really drew us to you, and why we wanted to bring you on to talk about this shift, because in your previous 10 years, in your previous life, you were on the reactive side. You were seeing clients after they had incidents, and we'll have you describe that, but you were on the reactive side, and you kept seeing, you were cleaning up the messes, if you will, and you were like, this is not right. Something's broken in the process of taking care of ourselves. And so you see this Aktiia as a part of the solution to not having to end up in the cardiac care unit of a hospital.
Yeah, I mean, so well said. I mean, so for 10 years, and I think that the two words that best describe this sort of juxtaposition is reactive and proactive. And I think that's what you really mentioned, Wendy. And you're right. So in cardiology and in specific, generally people come to me in clinic after they've had some problem, or when they're having some symptom, oh, I'm having chest pain, or I'm having trouble breathing, or I'm having, someone told me I had or I was in the hospital and I had some event. And then we do tests and procedures and surgeries if needed, and all the things that people are aware of about current sort of general cardiac care. And that's all great. I mean, we need those things, and it's great that we have them, and it's great that we have all this technology and training and resources for that to happen. But at the same time, it is very much a reactive process, and that most of the underlying causes of a heart disease or stroke or heart attack or heart failure, or you name it, are chronic and slowly developing processes that have gone on for decades. So usually people come to me, and oftentimes this very much happens usually after their event, surgery, procedure, hospitalization. They come to me back in the office and they'll say, Dr. Shah, why did this happen to me? Yeah. And they said, I try to eat well, I try to exercise, and many times there isn't some clear answer, but the answers, plural usually, are, well, you have you're a certain age, and after a certain age, things happen because we live on this earth for time, and our bodies slowly have developed these problems over time. Plus, you've had high blood pressure for a long time, or you've had diabetes, or you smoked for 25 years, and yeah, it's great you quit, but you did smoke for 25 years, and it takes its toll. And all these things that are what people generally call risk factors are long-term, chronic, slow, silent disorders that people don't quite realize are actively doing damage until they have the event that causes them pain or discomfort or symptoms or needing a test or procedure or hospitalization. And I think that's the sort of crux of the problem. And there's a lot of reasons for it, but that is the way that the medical system has historically and for a long time run. And now, we are approaching, I think, a sort of inflection point in medical care where people, companies, devices, inventors are starting to shift their lens towards how do we do something to prevent some of these how do we make things that keep people healthy without needing all these other tests and procedures and things. And I think we're just perhaps too late, but just turning that corner.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's this generation now that's going on right now, because we're more tuned into health, I think, than ever before. And I think the word that you use, the silent, that's huge. And we're so resilient when we're young, and we don't feel when we're doing things that aren't great for us. We don't necessarily feel ill, or we don't feel bad. And so we can do that and continue to do that and not feel it until here we are, middle age, and all of a sudden these events happen. And given that, even sometimes we don't even feel the events. I know some of the heart attacks are sometimes silent as well. So people, we are in a society where if you don't feel it, or if you can't see something right away, it's not there. It's not there, quote, quote. Right. So the idea, though, I think is becoming more trendy. I don't really want to say that, but it's becoming more trendy to be healthy, to be preventative. I know my kids, being the new Gen Z generation, they're so much more in tune with health and preventative stuff. So they don't need to be told, oh, you need to do this and do this, because they've been hearing it their whole lives. They know it. So, but your patients right now, and the patients that are future patients, we're hoping they don't get to that point. And that's why you got so excited about this company that you're working for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of those tailwinds are, some of them are not even medical device or medical technology tailwinds. Just think of things that people now wear routinely, or like health trackers or activity trackers or smart watches that do something vaguely that has something to do with health. They may not even be medical devices,
right?
But they start getting people's consciousness more aware and more activated that they should be thinking about their health in a different way. And then on top of that, like you said, Debbie said, I think, this sort of generational shift, probably starting, from 20 years ago of healthier choices, healthier, conscious eating and whole foods and, all these sort of things. And there's all kinds of debates within that, but generally speaking, there's a cultural awareness of what is healthier and what is not. And people have the great luxury of choice. Not everyone, but a lot of people have the great luxury of choice, of choosing better options. And so I think those two things combine to really, to what you said, is this sort of generational and cultural shift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That silent, that silence, I want to go back to that, because that's such a key for people. Because if we aren't measuring something, or we don't know, or if we don't have an awareness of something, we're not going to change our behavior, right? If it's not in front of us, if we're not measuring it, if we're not reporting, if we don't have an accountability partner of some kind, and because traditionally blood pressure is, you go to the doctor for a checkup, and so many people get white coat syndrome. And one of the questions that came to us from our listeners before we got on the phone with you is this idea, and I think I know the answer, but I want to hear it from you, is if I come to see you on a Monday and get my blood pressure taken on Monday, might it be completely different on Thursday? If I come to see you on Thursday, I mean, the range could be enough because I'm nervous about coming to see you for some reason because I've got white coat syndrome. Is that a thing?
Yeah, it'll be different the hour you leave my office.
Right.
So 35% of people have what's termed white coat hypertension. And so for your listeners, anyone who's not necessarily aware of that term, it means that you go to an office, a physician or provider's office, and you have your blood pressure checked at that one point in time, and it looks high. But at home or in an environment outside of the healthcare facility provider's office, it's normal. So for all intents and purposes, for the way that most providers look at blood pressure, which is their office readings, it looks high, and people can often be given a false diagnosis. And this concept or this sort of phenomenon is called white coat hypertension. In there's a white coat standing there, or glowering down at you, and you're sort of anxious, and for whatever reason, and you get this high blood pressure that's really not reflective of your true blood pressure. So Wendy, you said correctly. So your blood pressure is a continuously fluctuating parameter, just like many other parameters in our body, like glucose, like heart rate, like, all kinds of other parameters. But every minute to minute, hour to hour, it is slowly changing, sometimes more rapidly than others. And what in blood pressure and hypertension specifically, typically the cuff that everyone is aware of, that's how we measure blood pressure typically, gets your blood pressure at one specific point, literally 1 minute or less in time, and doesn't tell you anything about what happens before or after the next check.
Right.
And one of the major gaps in hypertension and blood pressure management is that people generally go for very long intervals in between blood pressure checks. So you don't know at all what is happening during that time. Right. Could it be normal in this instance of white coat hypertension? Sure. Could it be markedly abnormal in the instance of someone who has true hypertension and they just think that they have white coat hypertension because they feel anxious at the doctor? Right. Absolutely, it happens. Or there's even a concept called masked hypertension, where someone is normal in a physician's office but high at home. Wow. They don't know. Yeah. And because there are no symptoms with hypertension or blood pressure in general, very rarely, at least, any symptoms, there's really, unless somebody is routinely checking it, they really will have no idea. And on the concept of, I checked it once, and therefore that's my blood pressure level, is a completely false concept that's been routinely sort of debunked in academic, studies and stuff. So that, the idea that just checking it once a year or twice a year and it's normal, and then thinking that it's normal all the rest of the time, is not an accurate assumption. And so all blood pressure guidelines suggest routinely, especially for people who think they have hypertension or have hypertension, that they need to be very consistent and diligent about checking their blood pressure routinely over time, because to try to capture these fluctuations much better.
Right. Now, so that brings another question that I always have for my doctor, and now for you, is about the numbers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, there have to be numbers that people follow. We have to have these numbers that are there. But what Wendy and I do with our clients, and we say it over and over again, is that we're all unique individuals. And so what's good for me is not good for Wendy, and so forth. So I know these numbers come from somewhere scientific. I know that these numbers have been studied over time, but they're also changing. Like, they've changed in the last several years, just like cholesterol numbers have changed. And so skeptical people, me being one of them, says, oh, they changed the numbers. Now, is that truly true, or is it because pharmaceutical companies are saying change the numbers so that you can prescribe more medicines? So this is my dilemma. You tell me, how do they come up with these numbers, and how do they account for individuality?
So the first answer is that generally they don't account for individuality. That's kind of the purpose of guidelines, is to say, sort of give blanket statements to say that for most people, here are the guidelines of where we would target blood pressure. It is the art and job of the provider, physician or provider, healthcare provider, to then take those guidelines. Specifically, they're called guidelines. They're not called rules. They're not called laws. They're called guidelines. To take those guidelines and then to say, okay, what part about that guideline applies to you, Debbie? Do I apply the guideline as it's written? Do I apply a slightly tweaked guideline because I know you personally and I know that perhaps for you, we're going to, target a slightly different blood pressure range? That is the job, and really, honestly, some of the art of being a physician. So that's that part aside, though. To get to your bigger question, which is, where do these guidelines come from, and why are the numbers shifting sometimes as we see them, that they have over time? And the reality is, most of the shifts in the guidelines have to do with just accumulating knowledge base of science. So if you go back to sort of the advent of hypertension research, actually stemmed from FDR, who died, as most people know, with a hemorrhagic stroke with a blood pressure in the 300 over 180 millimeter mercury range.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. And so after that happened, the government sort of gave a request for proposals to study hypertension research. And it actually was the primary trigger for several physicians from Boston to set up the Framingham study. So the Framingham study is this landmark cardiovascular outcome study that started in 1948, studying a group of people who lived in Framingham, Massachusetts, over the next 20, 30 plus years. And there have been several generational studies that have gone beyond that. And it was the first study ever to show that high blood pressure was bad for you. Before that time, we didn't know. And that
was 1940 something?
Started in 1948. And was the first publication of hypertension showing a significant cardiovascular risk was in the early 1960s, I believe.
Wow.
Before that time, many physicians thought there's a reason for the blood pressure to be higher, physiologic reason. And so it actually was good, or in some ways responding to your body in some regard. And so the Framingham study was the first study to debunk that theory and to definitively show that high blood pressure is bad. And that's what, 60 years ago. That's it.
Yeah.
Then there was a group of studies from the Veterans Administration, the VA, where they showed that pharmacologic or medications to lower blood pressure improved outcomes. That was in the 1970s. So only in the 1970s did we even start to consider pharmacologic titration of medications or interventions to lower blood pressure that would actually improve outcomes. And then in the 80s and 90s, there was a number of medications that were developed by pharmaceutical companies and that have been sold on the market now for 40 plus years. And so that's over time, we see this sort of stair step in knowledge with this sort of accumulating knowledge base based on studies which generally take 5 to 10 plus years or long time to show that high blood pressure is bad, to show that treatment is good. And now we're at the point now 2023, but really the guidelines that really shifted the blood pressure targets came out in 2018 based on a landmark study called the SPRINT study. And they looked at lowering the blood pressure target by about 10 millimeters of mercury beyond what it was previously, which was 140 over 90, down to 130 over 80. And they thought there was enough benefit there. It was highly controversial, but they thought there was enough benefit there to make a change in the guidelines. And that's where that change came from. And so that's how sort of medical guidelines shift. It all is based on the best knowledge at the time that the guidelines are written. And so, that's the truth. And if anyone's wondering about, let's just say, pharmaceutical companies, the vast majority of medications for high blood pressure are generic. So there really is little incentive for any pharmaceutical company at this point in time to really, push more medication treatment. But that's really the overarching answer of why the guidelines shift from time to time. And it's, it's a slow and imperfect process, but that's science, and that's how it works.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So on the heels of that, I kind of want to share some stats with people. And the reason is because I think these are stats that I kind of ignore. I don't want to see personally because they're kind of scary. The stats about how many people are hurting. And one of the stats is that 1 in 5 heart attacks are actually silent. And that's a really big number. Another number is 1 person dies every 34 seconds in this country from heart disease. Every 34 seconds. And these numbers are from the CDC.
Yep. You want to hear some more numbers? There's 1.4 billion people in the world with hypertension, 130 million in the United States. 20,545 people die every day from hypertension. $370 billion per year. And the control rates in the last decade for hypertension, where we've had cheap generic medications and ready available cuffs, has declined by 25% in the last decade to a global control rate, ready? 20%, of a US control rate of 26%. So,
yeah, that's not okay.
No.
That's not okay.
But those are numbers that kind of put it in stark reality of how little proactive management or proactive, sort of impetus there is to really get control of these chronic diseases.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what causes high blood pressure? Like, why does that even happen to us?
We don't know.
That's the real answer, right?
There are factors that underlie it. We don't, for 90% or so of people with hypertension, they have what's called primary hypertension, which means that there's no other underlying cause that we can figure out that is causing their hypertension. For about 10 to 15% of people, they have what's called secondary hypertension. It's a much smaller number. And these are people who have a very clearly reversible cause of their hypertension. So, for example, people who drink a case of beer a day, or who have severe untreated sleep apnea, or who have some severe thyroid problem, that if you correct those problems or treat the sleep apnea or stop drinking the alcohol, their high blood pressure goes away.
Right.
So, but those are the minority of cases. In the primary hypertension bucket, the answer truly is the underlying cause for hypertension, we don't know. In fact, it used to be called idiopathic hypertension. Idiopathic is the medical word for I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's the reality. But there are factors that make it worse, and those we know about, right? So this obesity epidemic certainly drives up the prevalence and incidence of hypertension. Smoking. There are, chronic diseases such as kidney disease that relate to an increased incidence of hypertension. Sleep apnea, as I mentioned, can make high blood pressure worse. It's not the underlying cause for a lot of people, but it can make it worse. And so there are many other factors that go into making high blood pressure worse or better. Inactivity is another one, lack of exercise, those kind of things.
Right.
But the actual underlying cause is often unknown.
Very interesting. So this leads us right into, because of that, it's that much more important than to have some sort of monitoring to understand the silent epidemic for some of the things that we don't know.
Yeah. So the other part of the hypertension is that it often starts at young ages, and people are just not aware that it's silent, right?
Right.
This, as we said, it doesn't cause symptoms, and generally, oftentimes, will start in the 30s and 40s of life, sometimes even in the 20s. And as one of you mentioned earlier, is that people aren't engaged with the healthcare system when they're 20 and 30-year-old, right? I mean, you don't think there's no reason that you should be going to the physician generally.
Right.
You don't go
You're
very
immortal.
commonly. You know,
Right.
yeah, you're really healthy, you're exercising,
Right.
you do, you know, and so there's not an ingrained consciousness of monitoring your health data. Now, maybe that's changing generationally, but still, most of the time, that's the case. But that's when high blood pressure often starts, and the time between when it starts until some event occurs, that's actually the time, the opportunity. That's the time in which you have an opportunity to make changes to prevent that outcome. And so your point is exactly right, Wendy, is that we have to be able to show people that they have a problem so that they can interact with that data. They can know, they can become aware, they can become activated. They can empower themselves by doing things, whether it's through diet or exercise or talking to coaches like yourself or talking to their physician or talking to a nutritionist or whoever, to try to make some of those changes so that they can actually see a change and maybe prevent something in the future. And one of the biggest hurdles to this is a lack of engagement on people's side, because
of course,
the blood pressure cuff generally shows you a digital readout of your blood pressure, and that's it. Like, there's nothing else to it. It's just like, here's some numbers, no context, no information, no real like understanding of what that means. People might say, well, how did that? I checked it today and it means something, but like you said in your example, but on Thursday it was normal. So like, what do I do with this? I'll just put it in the closet and I'll check it again later, and then nothing ever happens, right? Like, that's usually what happens in by patients who come to see me. And the reality is if you can develop a tool that consistently shows people their blood pressure on a routine basis, that is doing it in a passive way, that where they don't have to do anything to actually measure their blood pressure, but they get exposed to their data, and they get exposed to, well, okay, so maybe it's high. Then I did dry January and I saw this significant change. Actually, maybe alcohol is a trigger for my blood pressure, and maybe I need to reduce my alcohol. Or I worked on my diet and I changed it, and then in February and March, I saw a significant improvement. Or, well, I really fell off the wagon in April, and look at that, my blood pressure went up again. There's a feedback loop that occurs. And we can't do that with symptoms, but we can, at least with what we're working on at Aktiia, we can do that in a digital way, creating sort of a digital feedback loop to really engage and create that activation. And so I think that's probably the best way that I can think of to do it.
Yeah. Well, you really pretty much just described it, but so let's be blatantly clear about it. The product that Aktiia has is a bracelet to monitor your blood pressure, right? You showed us earlier, and so people put that on, and they don't necessarily have to even pay attention to anything. Or they can, I imagine it's an app on their phone where they can check it. And can they connect that with their doctor? Tell us how it works.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's a very passive experience. There is partly it's a wearable, which is a very simple bracelet with a simple pod. There's nothing complicated in here. It's a 10-day battery life. You just wear it. That's it. And it automatically and passively delivers about 180 to 200 readings a week of blood pressure. And you can look at all that data on your app, which connects via Bluetooth. And if your healthcare provider or organization, is running our software, automatically the data automatically flows to them. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to email them. You don't have to sign onto your portal and do all that nonsense. Cool. It just automatically goes, so they can be part of your team, sort of proactively monitoring with you. And if you need some tweaks in management or interventions, they can actually see how those impact your blood pressure. So we try to solve a lot of the gaps in what we've been talking about, which is sort of this blood pressure hypertension space. And we think that there's impact at every phase along the continuum of sort of hypertension care, from awareness to empowerment and activation to better, more efficient, more accurate diagnosis, better treatment, faster treatment, and more efficient, more efficiently getting people to good optimal ranges, and then maintaining those optimal ranges over time. I mean, that's the continuum of blood pressure as I see it as a clinician. And generally, physicians only do it long after a diagnosis is made, then very slowly treatment, and eventually 26% or so in the US get to control, 74% never get there. So not really working that well, status quo. So,
right. It circles back to our original conversation in the very beginning about the prevention, knowing before something happens so that you can get in front of it instead of be reactive to it.
That's right. Yeah, and that's always the answer, to that question that I told you guys in the beginning, is that patients ask, what could I have done to prevent this? They're sitting there, they had their heart attack, they've had their treatment, they're doing okay, but they said, what could I have done to prevent this? And unfortunately, the answer is, well, maybe 20 years ago, if you had done X, Y, and Z and really maintained those changes over 20 years, that is probably the answer. But and that's a hard answer to give, but it's the truth. And so,
Right. So start now.
Exactly.
Yeah, start now.
So this is kind of a silly question, because I think I'm answering it by myself by saying, like, who is this product for? It's pretty much for everyone. Right?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the answer is that yes, there's 1 in 2 people over the age of 65 in the US have hypertension. A lot of younger people have it. It's 130 million adults. So chances are most of us, at least half of us are going to get it. And so in that regard, it can be done, it has value for almost, as I said, in almost every aspect of that sort of journey. And even if someone's had an event, then maybe it has more immediate impact to you if you've had a cardiac event or a stroke or something like that. But even for people who haven't had some event, but they just want to be more empowered with their own data, they want to be more engaged, and they want to understand their data more, then there's clearly advantages in that regard. And I guess the other part would be, caregivers. That would be the other part, is that oftentimes, especially as people get into older age, generally the people that are working with me, at least as a clinician, are actually not the patient, but it's their caregiver. It's their wife, it's their husband, it's their daughter, it's their son, it's whoever it is. And they're the ones who are managing this person's health, generally speaking. And they're the ones who are tasked with trying to get the data and trying to see what the blood pressure is and titrating medicines and figuring all those things out. And so for them, also it's an easier way probably to really, they have enough to keep track of, really. And so there's another, use for them.
Yeah. Is Aktiia going to be using, or do they get permission from patients to use this data for research for everything? I mean, because this seems to be really valuable data for the whole scheme of this, right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, so we do, people can elect to have their de-identified data pooled for research purposes. They can elect, of course, they don't want it, and that's fine either way. But yes, most of our users, especially in Europe, a lot of them do opt in. And the data that comes from our device, I mean, just think about this sort of exponentially higher degree of data. Now we can create these extremely complex data sets.
Absolutely.
And we're working with researchers across the world to starting to understand real, true insights from those data sets, instead of having this historically one-size-fits-all sort of treatment for blood pressure.
Right.
Maybe, Wendy's pattern of blood pressure is different than Debbie's, is different than mine. Right. Why is that? And what does those mean? And what do these specific patterns mean versus these other types of patterns? And we don't know yet. I mean, we just have all this data, and we're going now to look and doing all these, real significant outcome studies, cohort studies with investigators all across the world, trying to understand and pick out the insights from that data, so that eventually our goal is to have personalized blood pressure care at scale, for hundreds of millions of people.
Great.
It really is a tool that's so needed. So we know that at the time of this recording, you're on the cusp of launching in the United States. Is this correct?
Well, it's
Where are
coming
we?
soon. Yes, we're awaiting an FDA decision, and so after that, hopefully we'll have access to the U.S. market. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more details, like what is the cost to the consumer? Like where would they get it? It's coming. I know it's not quite here yet.
Yeah.
But give us those details.
Generally, so in Europe, how it's working is that buying really just direct from our website. That's the primary channel. Although now there are some sort of enterprise customers, including some payers and healthcare providers who are providing the devices and software directly to patients. But right now, the majority of the consumers or patients are just buying direct from our website. Okay. And that model would exist in the US, as well. And so we try to have, as we build our partnerships with healthcare organizations, that takes time, but individual users can have access to the device and the technology right away.
Great.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. Did I not? Did you cover the cost? Did we talk about?
Oh, we covered cost. So in terms of cost, yes, I forgot to mention that one. So in terms of cost, correcting for currencies, it's about $219 US. And that comes with everything. That's a one-time cost. Currently, no subscription with the software, the app, the calibration cuff. There is a cuff that comes with it for calibration purposes, and the bracelet all in one.
Wow!
All in one box. Yeah.
All right, that's really affordable for considering what it does. That's a great affordable option for people, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, traditional blood pressure cuffs are significantly cheaper. You can buy sort of much cheaper ones, but again, like you said, they don't really have the functionality that all the software and the back end that we have is built around. And of course, they don't collect the data like our device does. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So the name of the company is Aktiia, Actia.
Actually, it's Aktiia.
Gee whiz, I totally botched that.
That's okay. That's good. Just to ask the question.
Please tell us again how to spell it.
Yeah. Aktiia, and it's Aktiia.com is the website. You can go on there and you can sign up for updates, for the US in anticipation of US launch. And you can go and get on the mailing list there. And we're on all the usual social media channels as Aktiia Global.
Okay, great. And when are they expecting to launch in the US? Do they have a date?
As soon as we hear back from the FDA.
Oh, okay. That's all you need to say.
We're going to all go like this because all of our listeners are very curious about this. I know.
Yes, no, I appreciate that. And, where all digits are crossed. But that is the primary.
We're going to do some bird dogs and all this.
Yeah, exactly.
Put ourselves into pretzels for you.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I've got another question from our audience that I had meant to mention before. What is the impact of salt?
Oh yeah,
on blood pressure? Because I don't know if is it a continued myth? Is it true? Like where does salt follow or land?
It's kind of half and half. So it's actually exactly half and half. So we talk about salt all the time when people come in and have high blood pressure. But in truth, only 50% of people are actually salt sensitive, meaning their blood pressure is 50% of people, if you do reduce their sodium content, do have some reduction in the blood pressure. The other 50%, probably not. So there is some debate about that, but that again goes back to this sort of one size fits all
Yep.
talk track
Right.
for hypertension, right?
Right.
Is that I have this sort of, after being in medicine now, cardiology for 10 years, so when I talk about blood pressure, I can sort of off the top of my head, go down the list of the things I need to talk about, and sodium is always one of them. But the truth is, probably for half of the people, that sodium part of the conversation makes little difference. And we don't know who's sodium sensitive and who isn't.
Right.
And that is, again, getting back to that data set that we collect, we can start to pick out those insights. That's a good example of one where we can, put someone on a low sodium diet for a month, see what happens to their pattern, and does it make a difference or not? If it doesn't make a difference, and we're not going to tell that person to just go eat pizza and potato chips all day long, but I would say, well, sodium reduction and spending your energy and time really focusing on sodium reduction is probably not as high of a value as perhaps going out and exercising more or reducing alcohol content or doing, 3 other things. So let's be personalized about those recommendations. Right now, we have no way to understand how to be personalized about sodium reduction, or for that matter, any of those other lifestyle factors.
So interesting.
So it's not a myth. It's just that it doesn't apply for a significant percentage of people.
Right.
Yeah.
So helpful. Anything else that our listeners would want to hear, or anything else you want to share about the body?
I think the only other thing that I would probably want to mention is that, we have historically been, and we mentioned this before, talk about blood pressure as single point measurements in time, right? 130/90, 148/82, 130. And we've all explored in this conversation how little that matters as compared to sort of achieving over time an optimal range of blood pressure. Well, that concept actually has a name. It's called time in target range, or abbreviated TTR, time in target range. It's a concept that exists in diabetes for glucose control, meaning that the longer somebody spends in this optimal range, the better their overall risk is for some future event that's tied to blood pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, in the diabetes world, that actually has come into clinical practice with the advent of continuous glucose monitors, of CGMs, because for the first time, using those kind of devices, you can actually see their overall trend and actually get a sense of how much time are they spending in the optimal range.
Right.
So our device, Aktiia, is a very close parallel to that, except for blood pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So we can kind of show that, and it's already in the app, we already display it. How much time do you spend in an optimal range? And studies have shown over the last few years that concept, that metric, is a much more powerful predictor of cardiovascular events in the future than just hitting some arbitrary target of 140/90 or 130/80 at one point in time on one day. And so that is probably a much better metric to look at blood pressure. But the catch is, there is no device currently on the market that can actually measure time in target range, except for ours. And so that is sort of just another aspect of how this sort of data set can really empower a very near-term change to real clinical care and to real, to sort of the way we think about blood pressure in general. And that parallel has already been seen in diabetes, where the whole diabetes care has shifted to really incorporating this concept of time in target range. And it's a much more logical concept. It's just, it's never really been technologically possible to measure it on a real-time basis.
Until now.
That's great. This is exciting. Very exciting stuff.
Yeah,
It really
exciting.
is.
It is super exciting.
We're so happy to have met you and getting this information out into the public. And we just really are all behind you and behind Aktiia, and hoping that
Thank you.
we all want to help this world be a healthier place. And this is one tool that can help people do that.
Yes. Well, I really appreciate you having me on the show. Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure, and happy to come back anytime.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, both of you.
Okay.